Alicia Mayo. Welcome to the Bay Area Mental Health Hour. I'd like to welcome Dr. Ahnkesenamun Ball. Dr. Ball is the founder and clinical director of Being Integrative Clinical Solutions, LLC. She's trained in forensic and clinical neuropsychology with a focus on youth and adults. Since 2012, Dr. Ball has provided therapy, assessments, and consultations to patients, families, and professionals. Dr. Ball has trained and supervised others on mental health related topics, such as trauma, neuropsychological assessment, and the impact of race and culture on testing and academic performance. She is an advocate of mental health in all communities, but has a particular focus on individuals and families of color, breaking the preschool to prison pipeline and identifying equitable solutions for all in need of mental health services. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Ball, for this very important conversation.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
So let's begin with the impact of COVID-19 on families and children. Let's start with the financial strain it's had on those families in particular.
So the financial strain that has impacted many of the families who I work with or provide services for has been in some ways catastrophic, because families are really relying heavily on the no eviction clause that's in place right now, because they're not sure how to make rent. They're putting stays on most of their bills if they can, so that they can just try and make it from day to day. So the financial strain has been pretty significant.
In your practice, when it comes to advising your patients on just how to cope, resources, I mean, what kind of information or advice are you giving those families regarding finances?
I think it really depends on each family and their situation. And I always work really hard to stay within my bounds as a clinical psychologist. I'm not a financial advisor, but getting an understanding, one, of their comfort around talking about their finances is important, and two, developing an understanding of what they understand about their finances is another area that's important to discuss. So for families who have the means, who have some savings, or who have some, knowledge of how to navigate banks and applying for loans, or supporting families and identifying how to complete the PPP process by going through their banks. We've looked at many options in that way. Talking about going through EDD to obtain unemployment benefits. But if financial resources really aren't an option, additional financial resources aren't an option, I've assisted families in connecting with just locations for obtaining food and resources for their children. Some of the families that I've been fortunate to work with, unfortunately, don't have access to internet. So helping them to see if there's ways of accessing internet so that their kids can do schooling, or that they can continue to look for work. So it really depends on each family's situation, but we do come up with a targeted plan based on their access and based on their knowledge base. And for those who need additional help more than what I can offer, it's connecting them with local resources like case managers that can provide those services.
Continuing with the topic of the impact of COVID-19 on the families, what about the physical health of the children and the families that you're seeing? What are some of the concerns you have, and what are some of the presentations you've seen?
For me, I would have less concern about their physical health as a mental health clinician, but I do have concerns about their ability to get out, mobility, just play, you know, just having access to release some of this energy that young kids and even older kids have. The fact that we have been sheltering in place and parks and playgrounds have all been isolated or, you know, cordoned off because of the risk of transmission of COVID. I worry that kids are not developing the opportunity to exercise, to run, to just generally play and connect with other kids, which we know from multitudes of research that one of the best ways to help improve executive functioning is to allow kids to play. There's nothing like running around outdoors with other kids who, of course, are changing the rules to games and just having a great time to help them kind of think and strategize on how to get that next kid during a game of tag. Additionally, I worry about their mental health, just in relation to the lack of social opportunities that they have. It's really important for kids to connect. And when I say kids, I use that term loosely because it ranges from anywhere from under the age of 1 all the way up to the age of like 22, 24. Which is transitional
or 55
or 55, right? So it's really just important to have the opportunity to connect, and connection isn't solely based on verbal. Our occipital lobe is the largest lobe of the brain for a reason. We are completely and utterly constantly inundated with visual information from our environment, not simply from a screen. So the lack of opportunity to see people in their element really does actually contribute to, I would say, a sort of fatigue of only getting information from one visual mediated, you know, one visual stimuli, which would be a screen. So for me, it's really about kids having more opportunities to connect, to read those nonverbal cues and know how that nonverbal cue plays a role in context with the entire environment. And just really engaging. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is more kids engaged in games or activities on a screen, and it's not creating opportunities for dialogue or to practice their language skills. Also for kids who English is a second language or are second language learners, they're not getting an opportunity to connect with other kids to practice their English learning skills. And unfortunately, there's so many things that are, even though translated, are very English based, and some things don't translate very well. So it's another disadvantage. So overall, in terms of their physical and mental health, I do have concerns with the strain of being indoors rather constantly.
Yeah, that connection is there, the isolation and the inability to let off steam.
One other thing that I just wanted to point out in terms of the mental health of children who are indoors all day is just kids can be moody from time to time. And we're throwing in a bunch of other folks in the mix who are also struggling with the fact that they have to be indoors. And so there's a lot of emotion that is probably running rampant in many households. The latest research showed that there are numbers upwards of 60 or 70% of persons, these are adults, who are meeting the clinical depression and clinical anxiety marks. So if that data is for adults, imagine what's happening for kids, because they don't have the outlet, they don't have the opportunity to just kind of run amok out in the grass or, you know, be as creative and have that, you know, time with their peers, either at school or somewhere out in the community. So I think there's a lot of just stress that is building up in the home. And this is not just for families, but in general, people who have been isolated for so long are really struggling just with that lack of connection.
Yes, and that brings up the idea of the safety of the children with those adults who are experiencing those extremely high numbers of depression. Let's talk about the child abuse component. Unfortunately, it's not something that we like to think about, but it does exist and it happens. And you being an advocate for children and working in the courts with children and all, what are you seeing, and what are your concerns in terms of the safety of children during this time amongst adults?
Yeah, it is definitely an area of concern, and I just want to put out there that it's not simply just child abuse, but all forms of abuse have escalated during this time. So there's been increases in domestic violence, child abuse, animal abuse, just to name a few. Just people are really overwhelmed and stressed. Okay. So it is a pretty significant area of concern for many mental health clinicians. And I just want to point out that several areas of violence have increased in terms of domestic violence, child abuse, adult abuse, even animal abuse has increased. If you think about what's happening today, it's almost like a pressure cooker of stress. You have families who are trying to do everything that they possibly can to stay safe from COVID. They're sheltering in place. There is a record number of individuals applying for unemployment. So you're looking at economic strain. There just aren't as many outlets, and it just creates a ripe environment for pressure. If your child has been if you have a 4-year-old like mine who loves to sing at the top of their lungs and loves to talk incessantly, which is what most 4-year-olds do, it can be a real challenge if you don't feel like you have the opportunity to switch off with another parent, or you don't have the opportunity to let them run outside or to engage that energy in some positive way. And just us as humans, we're all a little short-tempered with the fact that we can't go out and do some of the things that make us feel human. There is an article that was, I believe, the New York Times, that was released about grief, that was just hitting the nail right on the head. Everyone is going through a state of grief at this point. We are grieving the experiences that we used to have, being able to go out to the store, go to the zoo, or just generally going and chatting with your neighbor without having to be 6 feet apart. So if you take all of that into consideration, you can quickly understand how people are losing their patience and how people are growing much more tired than they would be. Their frustration tolerance is a lot, lower than it's been in the past. And that, unfortunately, has resulted in kids being physically abused more or seeing emotional abuse. As I mentioned, parents are a lot shorter in terms of just managing the stress.
And what about the children managing the abuse, or, how do you deal with, or what would you say to a young child, let's just say, between 5 and 13 years old? What would you say to a child who needs to understand what's happening, why it's happening, and how they can keep themselves safe?
I think if it's a very young child, like 5, I would actually speak to the parent and the child. I would not isolate them, because they're not isolated. They come as essentially a pair, and helping the parent to understand the impact of the stressors that they're experiencing on their child, and then also helping the child understand that things are really hard right now, and using their language to help them really speak to what they're feeling. I love to help children actually use their voice most often, and we find that children are expected to be seen, not heard, and as a result, they're developing this tendency to not speaking for themselves. And of course, we also want kids to speak in a respectful way, but we also need for them to be able to voice their concerns. And hearing a 5-year-old say, "Mommy, it hurts my feelings when you yell and scream at me," it's sobering. It helps you to think about how you are responding to the situation, but it also helps to inform the parent on skills and techniques that they can use to create more space, to create more opportunities, to increase their frustration tolerance. And in doing so, it actually helps to build the communication between mom and child. Now, for older kids, I would do a very similar thing. I usually don't work with a child without a parent. I very, very rarely, only if there's concerns, would that ever take place. But I believe that treatment should include all of the necessary parties, because you can't just change one person. It's a unit. So I believe in bringing the parent and the child into the dialogue and helping them both understand. And then maybe this is my assessment mind, but let's identify what are the problems, what are some of the challenges, and why are they challenges, and giving them a way of creating a narrative around their challenges, so that it's not like yelling and screaming, why do you do this? Why can't you do this? Why can't you blah, blah, blah? But really helping them to understand, this is an area that is really challenging for me. I need a little extra help. Or can you help me do this, versus you never help me and I don't like you. All the things that I'm sure parents have heard. So it's really a matter of helping them to find their voice in a healthy way, so that they can communicate what their experiences.
Great, great, great. And what about teenagers? I have a 15-year-old who doesn't want to talk. He finds ways to just, ignore me. Sometimes I see him, going outside of his room and maybe going outside to the mailbox to check the mailbox or something. But that's about it. I have to, kind of negotiate, something with him. It's always a negotiation process with my 15-year-old and I. So how about those teenagers?
I think for teenagers, it's really important to think about where they are developmentally. And it's unfortunate at this point in time in their life that we're quarantined. Social engagement is a huge component of adolescent development. And it's usually around that age that they're really looking more to their friends for, camaraderie and support. And it's not that they don't love their parents or don't want to be around their parents all the time. I will say sometimes they don't want to be around their parents, but it's really about learning from a clinical perspective, it's really about learning the skills that they're going to need to navigate the world when parents aren't around. So it's really talking with them, not expecting them to divulge everything that they're doing in the day, but letting them know that you're there. And if they want to talk, you're open to chatting. If there are things that you absolutely need to know in terms of their safety, it's important to ask, and it's important to be direct and very clear. And the more respectful that the parent is, and the more respectful the child will be. It's a very challenging time, because you're going from seeing this person who you gave birth to being a beautiful child, little child, to growing into a young man or a young woman or a young person. And it's hard to kind of sometimes not want to just smother them with hugs and kisses and treat them like they were 5.
Or be that helicopter mom I used to be. Yeah, right.
And,
right.
they're learning to navigate the world in a different way. And it's important to give them that space. And if they're experiencing, a lot of verbal abuse or even physical abuse, what happens is they usually will become very quiet or insular. You can see a number of things. Some kids go real deep into social circles. I'm never going to be home. I'm just going to stay with my friends. Other kids stay in their rooms and they don't talk to anyone. There's a myriad of experiences that children who experience abuse can have. I think what is most important is helping any child who's experiencing any form of abuse, again, verbalize with a safe person what their experience is, and knowing that whomever they're speaking with is going to support them in getting, access to care that they can benefit from.
Okay. So just for the record, my child is a happy child, as far as I know. I do raise my voice from time to time, but yeah.
What parent doesn't?
Right. And then I have, Dr. Ball, I have a 21-year-old who worries constantly about his parents and his younger brother. He just seems to be this little worrywart, and I think it has a lot to do with the reality
Yeah.
about the world and the reality of how things can go terribly wrong in the world, where he can't control what's happening around
Right.
him.
Right.
So talk a little bit about those young adult children.
I think, again, everything is such, it's such a challenge right now, because for many young adults who are leaving home and going off to college and, you know, creating this identity about who they are in the world, it's been halted. Colleges are basically saying, we might be open, we might not. So you are going to have classes online. So I think, and I think for that generation where they've been unfortunately exposed to so many of the challenges that our society is facing, from global warming to the political climate to, you know, having to be confronted with Black Lives Matter or Brown Lives Matter, it's very disheartening, and it feels as if, gosh, what is going to go right? And now we're in a pandemic. So I think there is a lot to be worried about. And at the same time, it's really, I think, our jobs, either as parents and us as clinicians, and, you know, just as a community, to help our younger generation find ways of moving through this time period and understanding that this is a time period. It's not something that is permanent. And looking towards solutions of helping our society make better choices in the future, so that they are not carrying the weight of past generations who were not being mindful of global warming, or who weren't being mindful of, you know, how to take everyone into consideration when we're making new laws. So we are really looking at how to support this younger generation to have a voice, to basically be part of society in a way that's going to help propel us forward.
When is it time to consider psychological testing? If you and what would some of the signs and presentations or symptoms be for a child at home who is showing signs of extreme distress? Tell me what it'll look like and when we need to consider getting some help.
I think the question is really the most important factor in relation to psychological testing. For me, many of the children that come to me for testing have either been in therapy or have been dealing with something that hasn't been resolved, and there doesn't seem to be any resource that is offering a healthy resolution, or that they can understand why it's not offering a healthy resolution. So most often psychological or psychodiagnostic testing is used to really gain clarity into what is going on for a child who may be struggling with their moods. And it might be that previous to COVID, they were having outbursts and mood swings, and now we have COVID and they're continuing to have outbursts and mood swings, and maybe they're a little bit worse. And this child has gone through therapy, or this child has done groups, or has, you know, done some sort of activities to try and regulate, maybe even medication, and nothing is seeming like it is making an impact. That's when, for, you know, psychological reasons, we would do an assessment to get a sense of diagnostically what might be going on. Additionally, what I would also tend to recommend is, depending on what concerns the parents have, if the child is having a hard time just in their day-to-day functioning, where they're not able to take care of themselves in the way that is expected, and when I say expected in a healthy terms of expectations on children, it might be time to consider a neuropsych assessment. Because in neuropsych, we're looking at how is a person functioning in their environment? How is their brain functioning in the environment? And if they're not functioning quite well, what's getting in the way of that? Are they not interpreting the cues? Are they having a challenge, with organizing themselves, completing activities? There's a number of things that could be getting in the way. So we want to help create an understanding of what's going on, as well as help them to identify what their strengths and challenges are, so that if we need to help them develop what we call either compensatory skills, meaning you didn't have the skills, so we're going to find ways of helping you compensate, or we're going to help them rehabilitate, meaning maybe they were demonstrating this behavior in the past and it got weak, so now we're going to identify what the challenge is and then rehabilitate that process. Once we've identified that, we can create recommendations that support them in functioning in their environment, whether it's home or school.
So with children who have been diagnosed with maybe autism or Asperger's, that's where that rehabilitation will come in, because I've talked with a couple of child care providers that I know who have children of their own who have been diagnosed with autism, Asperger's, who are seeing the children regress. Mm-hmm. And they're desperately seeking some help. They don't know what to do. But are you talking about that rehabilitation for children like children with autism?
It's pretty much, yeah, any type of diagnosis. For children with autism or on the autism spectrum, it really, again, is looking at each individual child. It's understandable that we would see regressions in children on the autism spectrum at this time, because there has been a change in their routine, and many, not all, children on the autism spectrum have trouble with transitions. And it's very hard for the family to create a plan. Like, to some degree, this can be really helpful being in quarantine because it's the same routine over and over. At the same time, it's hard to predict how to create a plan on when to transition out, when to go back to school, and when to re-engage with the community, because we don't have a very clear timeline for that. So in terms of rehabilitation or compensatory skills, it really is dependent upon the individual and what skills they had previous to COVID and previous in their development versus what skills they just never really demonstrated or exhibited, and helping them to find ways around so that they can navigate the world in a healthier way.
Let's say a family decides to go through the assessments and get the testing. Where are they going to get that? Will it be online assessments and all of that? Is it being done in person?
At this time, there's a variety of answers to that question. There are some clinicians that are providing services in office. Many, like myself, or my practice is completely remote. So it really depends on, one, the question that they're asking and the services that they're hoping to obtain from getting tested, and also the need of the actual child. So for many of us who are working remotely, it is still possible to do assessment, but there are limitations to what we can provide. Given that this is a completely unexpected situation, we have had to modify our assessments to ensure that we're getting data that is valid. For those who are completing testing in person, it's pretty much, there are adjustments there as well. Wearing a mask or being completely decked out from head to toe in PPE changes the nature of the relationship. And especially if it's autism testing, not being able to fully see the mouth move or the face or things like that, we don't know what impact that has on the individual who's being tested. So there's a lot of things that we are really just working through as clinicians, trying to navigate the pandemic. But there definitely is a consensus on any practice that we do, trying to keep it as standard as possible. And luckily, many of the assessment producers are helping us to identify what we can do to keep it standard so that our norms are still valid.
And lastly, with children slowly beginning their online distance learning year with the schools. What are some of your main concerns, and give us some quick ideas, or compact, summarize some ideas about uh, how parents can prepare their students for this coming school year.
Sure. So we are definitely seeing that our state, at least California, is requiring that kids K through 12 distance learn at this time through the fall semester is what my latest understanding has been. And as a result, that means we are expecting all of our kids to have access to internet, to be able to sit in front of a Zoom. Well, let's go back. Access internet, be able to navigate internet, which most kids can do quite well, but also have the space and availability of a computer to complete their courses online. So as you can imagine, that's already strife one. We don't know that we do know that every child does not have access to a computer. We do know that every child does not have access to internet. And therein lies a huge stressor for the parent. Do they try and buy a laptop if they don't have the financial means? Are they asking for a laptop from the school? Are the schools offering laptops so that the kids can access their learning? So it's really, at this time, trying to figure out as early as possible how to access the tools needed to begin the online learning. Let's say that the parents have been able to secure a laptop, have internet, and are able to create a space for the child to learn. Then it's about creating a very clear schedule. There's been a number of articles to pop up recently about the importance of creating routine that during the week that is different than the weekend. His name is blanking. I can't think of his name, but there was an astronaut who wrote an article about the importance of space and time and creating space for you to do your daily work, and then also making sure that your routine is solid Monday through Friday. And on the weekend, you have some flexibility. As we're coming off of a summer or vacation, it's really important to start establishing those routines now and really helping your kids to transition from having free time pretty much whenever to you're waking up at 8:30 or 8, depends on when your schooling starts, but definitely being up and ready by getting dressed, even if you're not going anywhere, brushing your teeth, brushing your hair, things like that. And then having a dedicated zone as to where you're going to do your schoolwork, not in bed if possible. Even if there's not a lot of space, creating maybe a partition. We like to recycle a lot of cardboard, so it might be creating a partition out of cardboard that can be your background, but creating a space for your child where they can actually sit and work during the time that's been allotted to them from their school.
And I would say that's, as a former educator, that's excellent advice about creating that partition, that space, whether they have a computer there or not, or maybe they're just working from the packets, the paper packets. However, they are learning. We want to make sure they're learning, and they're learning in a comfortable, well-lit, well-ventilated space, because they can be sitting there for some time. But let them take breaks as well, while they're studying, to get outside, to get some sunshine, walk to the mailbox or back, whatever. But creating that routine, I think, is really important as well. So thank you so much for that advice. Any last thoughts?
Yes, I would say that while I know that I made the recommendation of having the space and the screens and the partition, I understand that's for older children who have the capacity to sit in front of a screen, and that is very different than having younger children under the age of 5 And if you're also trying to balance work with having kids, it's definitely important to make sure that you are taking breaks as well as you're having breaks with your child. And that there are ways to navigate having your kids working with you at home. I don't want to create the idea that I think parents should have their child be their coworker. I think parents should be able to communicate with their employer their needs so that they can have a flexible schedule. But the important thing is create space for yourself, create space for your child, and to really have the opportunity as much as you can to balance out the stressors that are really befalling all of us. We are navigating a completely new situation, and as a result, it can be really challenging. But knowing that you can definitely take a step back, you can, come up with ideas and tools for keeping your children active while also, having that business meeting and letting people know I'm working with my children as well. So if I step away, I'm still doing my work. So I think the theme of all of this is definitely increasing communication and really being clear about what your needs are. And the more that those are communicated amongst individuals within the family, it's a higher likelihood that can decrease the stress that families are experiencing.
So thank you, Dr. Ball, for guiding us through all of the questions and concerns. It was a pleasure to have you here, and we look forward to more conversations with you about children and their families.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to sit and chat with you about some of the issues that COVID has created for our families.
We will continue to gather together in support of each other here on the Bay Area Mental Health Hour. So please look for us on YouTube and on Facebook. You'll also find short clips of our shows on Instagram and Twitter. We'll also share contact information about Dr. Ball and other resources mentioned here during the show. For the Bay Area Mental Health Hour, I'm Alicia Mayo. Keep yourselves and your families healthy, safe, and sane. We'll see you next time.